They say I'm a Sagittarius. So on my birthday, you might expect the sun to rise in the constellation Sagittarius. And it did, 2,000 years ago, when the Babylonians made all this up. But it doesn't now. Now on my birthday, the sun rises in Scorpio, not Sagittarius. See, astrologers are off one full sign. In 2,000 more years, they'll be off 2 signs. But they don't seem to care.
The late philosopher of science Paul Feyerabend was referring to attacks against astrology when he wrote about the extent to which scientists will assert their authority even in areas where they have no knowledge whatsoever. Perfectly illustrating this point is when scientists try to debunk astrology based on their argument of precession and the changing signs. How many different motions do you think the Earth makes? Spoiler alert, there are 3. One of them is precession. Let's look at them now. Most people are aware of 2 primary motions that Earth makes as it travels through space. If you're to measure a year by the Earth's movement through the stars, then one orbit of the Sun would be exactly a year, and you'd be measuring what's called the sidereal year. To understand this, let's use a crab to represent the constellation of Cancer. This is the Sun. The constellation Cancer is directly behind it. And when we place the Earth here, all 3 of them are in a perfectly straight line. When Earth begins its orbit of the Sun from that point in its measurement of a sidereal year, then in 3 months it'll make a right angle to Cancer, and in 6 months it'll be on the other side of the Sun. As it continues this yearly progression through the stars, it'll eventually make its way back to the exact point in space where the Earth, Sun, and Cancer again are in a perfectly straight line. At this point, the Earth has completed 1 full sidereal year. But our calendar isn't based on the sidereal year. Instead, it's based on what's called the tropical year, which is based on the seasons. Let's understand the tropical year. Most of us have noticed that globes, like the ones found in classrooms, are always tilted. The reason for this is that the actual Earth itself is tilted in relation to the Sun. This line represents the equator and shows how one half of the Earth, which we'll call the northern hemisphere, is tilted towards the Sun, while the other half, which we'll call the southern hemisphere, is tilted away from the Sun. It's because of this tilt that we have seasons in the first place. Without it, there would be no seasonal change throughout the year. Because the northern hemisphere is tilted towards the Sun in this position, it's getting a lot more sunlight, which means it gets the most light and heat, which means it's going through its summer. But while the northern hemisphere is enjoying its summer season, the southern hemisphere is getting the least light and heat from the Sun,
meaning it's going through its winter. But don't fret, as Earth travels around the Sun, these seasonal positions will change, and in 6 months, the Earth will have traveled halfway around the Sun. Where the northern hemisphere is no longer tilted towards the Sun, the southern hemisphere is. The northern hemisphere enjoyed its summer 6 months ago, but now it celebrates its winter season, while the southern hemisphere gets its turn to bask in the summer light and heat. But Earth doesn't stop in its orbit around the Sun, and in 6 more months, the Earth will return to the position where the northern hemisphere again tilts towards the Sun, returning it to the summer season that it enjoyed 1 year ago, when measured as the tropical year.
These two ways to measure a year would be exactly the same if it wasn't for the little-known third motion of the Earth called precession, which is a wobble, much like the wobbling of a top as it's slowing down.
Trying to let you know. Signal 보내, signal 보내. Hey!
Remember this? It was the marker point for the start and end of our sidereal year, where the Earth, Sun, and Cancer were lined up perfectly straight. But because the Earth is making this motion in precession, it's not always the same season when Earth is aligned with Cancer. Replacing the Earth with our spinning top, you can see that when Earth is in the sidereal position with Cancer, it's constantly changing the season. Sometimes the northern hemisphere is pointing towards the Sun, making summer. Sometimes the northern hemisphere is pointing away from the Sun, making winter. But in this example, we see that the tropical seasonal year is completely separate from the sidereal year of the stars. Here, no matter which season the Earth is going through, it remains aligned in the same sidereal position.
One Earth wobble takes about 26,000 years, so it's a very slow process, but it still makes the sidereal year longer than the tropical year by about 20 minutes, which adds up. The problem with this argument is that Western astrologers did account for precession 1800 years ago, when Claudius Ptolemy proclaimed that the signs of astrology were separate and distinct from the stars and constellations. This is a copy of Ptolemy's book on astrology, Tetrabiblos. This particular translation was done by J.M. Ashmont and published in 1822. In Book 1, Chapter 12, it says, "The beginning of the whole zodiac circle is assumed to begin at the sign of Aries, which commences at the vernal equinox."
The phrase vernal equinox has Latin roots from which vernal refers to springtime and equinox means equal night. The vernal equinox, then, is the first moment of spring where, at the equator, night and day are of equal length. In the southern hemisphere, the start of Aries corresponds with the autumnal equinox, which is the first day of autumn. Although Ptolemy neglected to address this detail, time and experience have proven these respective seasonal starting points to be accurate.
From that passage alone, we see that Ptolemy has associated the signs with the seasons, and for the first time it has been separated from the constellations.
Until the discovery of precession, Western astrologers were using the sidereal zodiac. This is why Ptolemy clarified the change to the tropical zodiac in his book.
Precession was discovered 250 years before Ptolemy's time by a mathematician and astrologer named Hipparchus. Ptolemy studied Hipparchus's work extensively. In fact, if it wasn't for Ptolemy's work, we would know very little about Hipparchus's, because very little of Hipparchus's work survived history.
Astrology had been around for thousands of years before Hipparchus's time. Its earliest texts, called the Enuma, Anu, and Lil, were written on cuneiform tablets in the Old Babylonian period, dating to nearly 4,000 years ago. The discovery of precession brought changes to our calendars and also changed the zodiac of Western astrology from the sidereal zodiac to the tropical zodiac. Now, Vedic astrology of India shares the same roots as Western astrology, but did not embrace the change from the sidereal to the tropical zodiacs. The start of their zodiac circle remains fastened to the start of the Aries constellation. Aside from that starting point, however, Vedic astrology maintains little other connection to the constellations. Whether the sidereal zodiac of India is better, or whether the tropical zodiac of Western astrology is better, is a very touchy subject.
So, in these reflective moments, I ask myself, am I a fun-loving Sagittarius or a sexy Scorpio?
Sorry, Bill. Comparing accuracy of the two systems is saved for a future episode. When skeptics mock astrologers for not having accounted for the changing signs, they simply don't realize that it's because astrologers did account for the changing signs that skeptics can attempt that argument in the first place.
So when Paul Faraband criticizes scientists for using their authority to sway public opinion on things for which they have no knowledge whatsoever, we can see just how true that is. These scientists may wield the respect of an emperor, but it doesn't take much to realize that when it comes to astrology, they simply aren't wearing any clothes.